about the soul of their minds. Yeah, not a thing or two, or about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no taking back would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name's Mark. I'll be your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by Joe, an old friend from college. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Joe, this week's topic is something that's been on my mind off and on for quite a while. Going back to the pandemic, I started to get interested in psychedelics, magic mushrooms, that sort of experience. And even way back in college, I always kind of wanted to have psychedelic experiences because, disclosure, I do not remember my dreams. For me, going to sleep is going into a black box. So when I wake up the next morning, I have no memory. And I've always been jealous of people who have these fabulous dreams. And for me, the idea of taking something like peyote promised a construction of a dream in the moment and that I'd be able to remember it. I did not do anything about peyote, but I did have some mushroom experiences. And as part of preparing for that, I did a little bit of reading on the history, the thought around psychedelics. And so I do know that psychedelics had a little bit of 15 minutes, and starting with the 50s and the 60s and going up to the early 70s, there was sort of a swirl around psychedelics as very interesting substances. But then there was this enormous crackdown in the 70s, maybe because they became so associated with the hippie movement. So both legally and scientifically and in the public consciousness, there was this backlash against psychedelics where they were just branded as not only dangerous, but just straight up illegal. And it's only recently that the tide has started to turn on that a little bit, and people started to talk about psychedelics' therapeutic effects, particularly with conditions such as depression and the treatment of PTSD. And that's super interesting for me, not just the fact that psychedelics are coming back around, but I'd really like to learn more about the thinking about why a psychedelic drug is helpful in these contexts. I thought that this would be a super interesting thing for us to discuss, so I set you off on it, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you learned.
It is a super interesting topic, and I'm going to go into much more detail about a lot of the things you just summarized. But I want to start, as I often do, by defining our key word. In this case, it's psychedelic, before I get to the history and the science of psychedelics and their effectiveness. So the word psychedelic was coined by the English psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond in a letter to the author Aldous Huxley. Osmond had taken LSD and mescaline to try to understand their properties. Then he gave some mescaline to Huxley, who wrote a book about his experiments with it called The Doors of Perception in 1954. Osmond's coinage of psychedelic combines two Greek words, the noun psyche, which means mind, and the verb delos, which means to reveal. Today, the term psychedelics refers to a group of non-toxic, non-addictive psychoactive substances that can significantly alter your cognition, perception, mood, social relatedness, and sense of self. There are chemical differences between them, but generally speaking, I'm talking about drugs like lysergic acid diethylamide, commonly known as LSD, psilocybin, the active ingredient in the hallucinogenic mushrooms you referenced, mescaline, the active ingredient in the peyote cactus used by Native American tribes, dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, the active ingredient in ayahuasca, the brew made by indigenous tribes in the Amazon, 3 or 4 methylene dioxymethamphetamine, or MDMA, popularly known as ecstasy, ibogaine, derived from the bark of iboga, a Central African shrub, and finally ketamine. Some of the most notable reported effects from the use of these substances include hallucinations, out-of-body experiences, ego dissolution, a feeling of connectedness, unity, or oneness, synesthesia, the blending of senses, and quasi-mystical, revelatory, spiritually significant experiences involving the transcendence of time and space.
As you're going through that list, it was as if it was a menu that you're putting in front of me, and I was putting checks next to the experiences that I had. But yeah, lines up.
Yes. Psychedelics include both naturally derived substances like psilocybin and synthetic substances like LSD and MDMA. Of course, humans have ingested consciousness-changing substances like coffee, tea, and nicotine forever. But we've also used naturally occurring psychedelics for millennia. Ancient Greeks like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle drank a psychoactive brew called koukeon during secret enlightenment rituals called the Eleusinian Mysteries. The Mazatec Indians of Mexico referred to psilocybin, which is naturally produced by more than 100 species of mushrooms, as God's flesh, and used it in spiritual rituals akin to the Catholic Eucharist. Mescaline was also used in religious rituals, and people who took it reported being able to see and commune with God. Flash forward to 1943, when the Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann's discovery of LSD's psychoactive properties led to the use of natural and synthetic psychedelics in clinical research in the 1950s and 1960s as potential treatments for a range of conditions, including mood and substance use disorders, with some very promising early findings. Now, this is that 15 minutes you referred to in your intro. And this is a really interesting 15 minutes. During that period, LSD was considered a miracle drug. The co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous quit drinking after revelations he experienced on an LSD trip. The CIA was experimenting with it, and one of the volunteers they dosed was Ken Kesey, who soon became a proselytizer of the drug. It was perhaps inevitable that it would escape the proverbial lab into the public square. The recreational use of LSD was greatly amplified by the Harvard clinical psychologist Timothy Leary, the guy who said, "Turn on, tune in, drop out," and then further popularized by cultural icons like the Beatles, whose songs in 1966 and 1967 reflected their experimentation with LSD. However, growing public concern about illicit drug use generally, and the non-medical use of psychedelics specifically, the whole hippie culture you referenced, led to a moral panic and cultural backlash, culminating in passage of the Controlled Substances Act in 1970, signed into law by President Nixon, in which most psychedelics were codified as Schedule I controlled substances with no accepted medical use. That is, illegal at the federal level.
Yeah, I can remember from childhood, so this had probably been 73, 74, based on when I remember how old I was, that in just what we kids were saying to each other, LSD was presented as something that would immediately and irrevocably send you insane. Like you take it and you would just be lost. Your brain would be cooked forever. That was where it was in popular parlance at the time.
Yes, it's a psychedelic version of Reefer Madness. Did you ever see that movie? Where they said use of marijuana would make you crazy and turn you into a psychopathic killer.
Right, right. And the mention of that reminds me that I once did some research on the history of tobacco, and one nugget buried in there is that if you ingest enough nicotine, it actually has psychedelic properties, but you need to ingest so much that you can't get it through smoking, which is a pipe or a cigarette. You have to ingest the tobacco by way of enema, like take it straight up the ass in order to get the dosage to basically see God. So,
oh my God, I pity those intrepid pioneers who volunteered for that project. Okay, anyway, Psychedelics are still, to this day, categorized as controlled substances. But after decades of prohibition and stigmatization around the early 2000s, so, roughly this century, the last 25 years, researchers and regular citizens alike came to believe that many potentially useful medicines had become unnecessary casualties of the so-called war on drugs. These folks ushered in what has become known as the psychedelic renaissance, revisiting the potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics in treating a broad range of psychiatric disorders, including depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, generalized anxiety, and substance use disorders, while seeking legal and regulatory means to study them. The positive findings from early clinical trials of psilocybin and MDMA led to the emergence of numerous biotechnology startups hoping to develop psychedelics as medicines. In a 2023 survey, 81% of psychiatrists agreed that psychedelics show promise in treating psychiatric conditions, with more than half hoping to incorporate psychedelics into their practices upon FDA approval. Research on the efficacy of psychedelics looks so promising that the FDA granted breakthrough therapy status to MDMA for the treatment of PTSD in August 2017, followed in October 2018 by psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, and then in 2024 by a derivative of LSD for generalized anxiety disorder. Now, breakthrough status basically fast-tracks the development, review, and approval process for drugs that treat serious conditions when the preliminary clinical evidence indicates they might be clearly better than currently existing therapies. Those of you who listened to our episode on GLP-1 drugs might be interested to know that the active ingredient in Ozempic was designated a breakthrough therapy for weight loss. In August 2024, the forward momentum suffered a setback when the FDA declined to approve a new drug application for MDMA for PTSD, despite positive findings from 2 separate Phase 3 trials, and instead asked the sponsor to conduct a third Phase 3 trial. Because of that setback, it now looks like psilocybin, which has already been legalized in Australia, the Canadian province of Alberta, and in Colorado and Oregon for medicinal purposes in supervised settings, will be the first psychedelic to receive FDA approval, perhaps as early as 2026. The American right seems to be on board with psychedelics. This past June, Texas appropriated $50 million to study ibogaine. The Trump administration and HHS Secretary RFK Jr. have prioritized the expedited approval of psychedelic-assisted therapies and might even waive some controlled trials.
I have to say that surprises me. I was arming a follow-up question in anticipation of you telling me that the decision to move forward with psychedelics had been done under like Obama and Biden, and the Trump administration was going to reverse ground on that. But now you're telling me that now things are continuing as before.
No, it's exactly
Unexpected.
the opposite. The new drug application was denied by the Biden administration, and it's Trump and RFK who want to see it fast-tracked. And, there's this new tell-all book about RFK, just came out this week, that basically says he's a regular user of psychedelics. So there's a personal motivation there.
That actually makes a lot of things make sense with that information.
Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I understand RFK Jr. more now, knowing that about him.
Yeah. Okay, so I've brought us up to date on where we stand in this new psychedelic renaissance, but you wanted me to focus on the science of psychedelics, so here we go on that part. There are 2 main neurochemical reasons why psychedelic drugs appear to help people cope with depression or trauma. The first is that they seem to enhance both structural and functional neuroplasticity, which is the brain's ability to reorganize itself and form newer and healthier neural pathways, essentially by regrowing lost or damaged synapses in regions like the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. The changes appear to last even after the immediate effects of the drug have worn off. This process serves as the brain's version of repairing damaged circuitry caused by chronic stress or trauma. It promotes cognitive flexibility and learning, which can lead patients to develop a changed perspective about their trauma. One user described it as a way for people to, quote-unquote, reboot their consciousness. An article I read from Cambridge University uses another helpful analogy. Quote, "You could think of neural pathways being like well-used roads. The more we use the same routes, the more reinforced they become. By going down paths less traveled, we can make surprising connections and reframe how we perceive ourselves and the world." End quote. Creating new connections may also allow patients to unlearn the severe emotional reactions to traumatic memories. For example, one study I read reported that the use of LSD and psilocybin led to, quote, decreased processing capacity in brain areas responsible for making sense of information and relating it to memories, end quote. The second way psychedelics help is that they reduce activity in key brain networks, particularly the default mode network, or DMN, which is highly active during task-free resting states. The DMN is associated with things like ego maintenance, daydreaming, rumination, and self-referential thinking. You know, the stories we tell about ourselves, which are usually harmless in psychologically healthy people, but often become hyperactive in people with PTSD, depression, or anxiety. Psychedelics reduce connectivity within the DMN, which disrupts and breaks the cycle of what researchers call maladaptive strategies, those deeply ingrained patterns like negative thinking or compulsive substance use that people with those conditions struggle with every day. After taking psychedelics, patients seem able to experience themselves and the world in a different way, allowing them to move past negative self-impressions and destabilize the rigid thinking that plagues them. Frequently reported effects of psychedelic use include heightened introspection, accessing thoughts or memories suppressed in ordinary states of consciousness, and the ability to process repressed emotions like grief, guilt, or fear. Here's a way of thinking about psychedelics that helped me to understand them better. It involves the concept of critical periods in brain development. We've all heard about how there's a critical window for language in childhood, and if children aren't exposed to it by the time that window closes, they'll be unable to fully command language, even as adults. Well, psychedelics modify neural pathways that increase neuroplasticity in the brain, which in turn opens that critical window and temporarily allows the brain to be, as an article I read put it, quote, extraordinarily receptive to new ways of thinking, feeling, and processing information about the world and oneself, end quote. Just like a child. I should note here that antidepressant drugs do similar things, but they must be taken every day, they have side effects, and it takes much longer for them to show results. Early testing of psychedelics has thus far indicated that they only need to be taken once or a few times to yield benefits, and they have little to no side effects. Also, and I think this is a key distinction, antidepressants treat the symptoms of conditions like depression, PTSD, etc., while psychedelics at least show the potential to treat the root causes of the trauma. Trauma underpins many of the dysfunctional behaviors of adulthood, like alcohol and opioid addiction, just to name a couple. So treating their root causes can be life-changing. Investigators are studying a number of neurobiological and psychological processes affected by particular psychedelics. I'm going to name a few now. So-called classical psychedelics like LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT activate the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. Serotonin is a chemical messenger that helps neurons communicate. It's especially important for regulating mood, and activating its receptor helps in the treatment of depression and substance use disorders. In animal testing, psilocybin has been shown to help extinguish fear, which may help human PTSD subjects break the traumatic cycle of stress-induced terror. Unlike LSD, mescaline doesn't cause hallucinatory visions that distort reality. It's more about apprehending a deeper, more fine-grained reality. Non-classical psychedelics that produce similar effects through different mechanisms include MDMA, ketamine, and ibogaine. MDMA was patented in 1912 by the pharmaceutical company Merck as a side product of another drug they were developing. It basically sat on a shelf until the 1970s, perfectly legal until 1985, and no longer under patent, when an intrepid biochemist named Sasha Shulgin synthesized it. MDMA involves a more complex mechanism that releases a flood of the brain's own serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and may also stimulate oxytocin, all of which typically improve one's sense of well-being by increasing feelings of empathy and social connectedness while lowering stress responses. No wonder it's called ecstasy. It essentially switches off the brain's fear center, the amygdala, the seat of the fight or flight response, which makes MDMA especially useful in treating PTSD. It increases connectivity to the prefrontal cortex, which reduces anxiety and allows patients undergoing therapy to revisit and process traumatic memories without being overwhelmed by them.
My understanding on that therapy is that since memories themselves can be plastic, like each time you access a memory, you have the opportunity to reshape how you remember it, that they administer these drugs like MDMA that short circuits the fear response and makes you feel more empathic and connected. And then they have you recall the incident. And the drug helps you remember the incident in a manner which is less fear-inducing, more easy for you to accept and process it, so that when later you then re-remember it, you remember it in a more positive light. That's my understanding of how that works.
Yes, I watched some clips of therapy in which exactly that thing happened, so I think that's true. I didn't read about the method used by the psychiatrist, but I saw that in some of the videos I watched. Ketamine is technically a dissociative anesthetic with psychedelic properties, mostly used by veterinarians, but also used off-label for its rapid antidepressant effects. And famously, Elon Musk has publicly stated that he takes ketamine to treat his own depression.
Also famously, Matthew Perry, who played Chandler on Friends, drowned in his own pool while high on ketamine.
Yes. Yeah, and I think the person who supplied him with the ketamine just went to jail for that. Ketamine targets a different system of neurotransmitters than the classical psychedelics. Ibogaine is being studied to treat substance abuse disorders, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Its mechanism of action is poorly understood, but seems also to affect neurotransmitters. As you can just glean from what I said, in my research for this episode, I read the abstracts of a bunch of recent medical studies on the use of psychedelics for treating mental health and substance abuse disorders. Here are some headlines from those studies. The most extensively studied therapeutic intervention involves MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. This is the thing we were just talking about a minute ago. The results demonstrate that it may meaningfully decrease the severity of PTSD symptoms and even lead to short-term disease remission for some individuals. That's especially noteworthy because about 6% of the U.S. population will experience PTSD at some point in their lives, and about half of that number won't respond to first-line antidepressants. In the Phase 3 clinical trials I referenced earlier, 71% of the participants undergoing MDMA-assisted therapy exhibited such significant improvement that they no longer met the diagnostic criteria for PTSD at the end of their treatment protocol, as opposed to 46% for those who underwent therapy only. Studies are now underway to use MDMA in the treatment of addiction. Psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression also shows great promise, especially for how fast it works. Unlike standard antidepressants, psilocybin often exhibits noticeable effects within hours, its therapeutic benefits lasting weeks or even months. Psilocybin-assisted therapy also required only 2 doses while maintaining its antidepressant benefits, all of which suggests that psilocybin might be preferable for many patients. That's no small matter, especially given all the recent reports about how the rising use of antidepressants among teenagers seems to adversely affect their sexual development. Clinical studies have shown that LSD increases empathy and lessens anxiety and depression in similar ways to antidepressants like Prozac. But unlike Prozac, patients treated with LSD report that it, quote, gives new meaning to the experience of suffering, an alteration of consciousness, and a feeling of transcendence, end quote. I didn't read that Michael Pollan book you mentioned to me, How to Change Your Mind, but I did watch the 4-part, 4-hour Netflix documentary series based on the book and hosted by Pollan. It traces the history of the 4 most common psychedelics, but is also full of stories about how they've profoundly improved people's lives. Pollan speculates about how the, quote, deeper sense of interconnectedness with nature, end quote, triggered by the reintroduction of psychedelics, might even help us to combat climate change. One of the advocacy groups he spotlights in the series is Decriminalize Nature, which reframes our country's disastrous war on drugs as a war against plants, which I think is a fascinating prism through which to look at the case for psychedelics. How can plants growing on our green earth be illegal? How can you put people in jail for years, for decades sometimes, for ingesting plants? On whose authority is that illegal? Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us, because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really. It's pretty obvious at this point in my presentation, I think you would agree, that psychedelics are potential game changers for the field of psychotherapy. But that doesn't mean there aren't any lingering challenges or questions about their usage. In fact, there are many. Here's a big one. I want to drill down on it at length because I think it's so important. If and when the FDA approves psychedelics, it'll be for medical use, not for recreational use. Many people have taken psychedelics recreationally without experiencing therapeutic benefits. On the contrary, recreational users have had countless bad trips on LSD or magic mushrooms. Bad trips usually happen when users feel unsafe or uncomfortable, and they can increase trauma rather than ameliorating it. Researchers are optimistic that psychedelics will yield rapid therapeutic benefits, but only when combined with intensive psychotherapy in a carefully controlled environment. So let's talk about this. The term of art I encountered over and over in my reading about what constitutes successful psychedelic therapy was set and setting, with set referring to the mindset of the patient. This treatment protocol is still in its infancy, and it'll likely take years for the psychiatric profession to train the workforce and build out the infrastructure necessary to deliver high-quality psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. One thing we already know is that the efficacy of psychedelics is heavily dependent on what the clinical psychologist Rosalind Watts called non-drug elements, like, quote, the degree of trust patients feel toward themselves, the therapist, and the substance, end quote. Without that trust, she said, patients may be, quote, unable to surrender to the experience and make the most of it, end quote, thus potentially rendering psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy ineffective or even dangerous, like a bad trip. The question, then, is whether we can separate the drug's efficacy from that of the non-drug elements. As Watts put it, quote, we mustn't underestimate the importance of the care and the connectedness that psychedelic therapy offers people and how much of an impact that has on the outcomes, end quote. That's precisely why the psychotherapy associated with psychedelics is so intensive. A central part of the therapeutic process is the profound, mind-altering states of consciousness they induce, which approach mystical or religious experiences in some people and often involve a dissolution of ego, that is, the loss of one's usual sense of self. In a structured therapeutic setting, such experiences can lead to meaningful personal insights and a new, more expansive perspective on past traumas that can be incorporated into one's daily life. I keep using terms like structured and process because they're considered essential for maximizing benefits and minimizing psychological risks. Best practices for a therapeutic framework include an initial consultation, informed consent, supervised dosing, and in the weeks thereafter, post-session integration therapy, in which the patient, with the therapist's help, attempts to make sense of and derive meaning and purpose from the psychedelic experience. Rosalind Watts recommends a course of psychedelic therapy involving what she calls the 3 pillars of acceptance, connection, and embodiment. Accepting and being willing to feel emotions while under the influence of the drug. Connecting with the present moment, bolstered by post-treatment integration sessions. And embodying the experience as it's felt in the body, in which the buried trauma might manifest itself as, say, a tight feeling in one's chest. To enhance the therapeutic benefits of embodiment, Watts recommends things like hosting sessions in a comfortably appointed clinician's office, having 2 therapists present, videotaping the sessions, and using curated music playlists during sessions, which can serve as a de facto 3rd therapist. These things help people feel safe enough in their bodies and open to emotions that they might otherwise resist. Sounds great, right? But here's my point about this thing I'm talking about here. Are those treatment protocols reproducible and scalable in the real world where people are pinched for time and money? How do you fairly reimburse practitioners for a therapy that's so time and labor intensive without pricing it out of the market?
Yeah, I definitely had a lot of these things on my mind when I was creating my own psilocybin experiences. Set and setting were something I thought about a lot. And even some of the for pay services, like there was a clinic in Jamaica that you could fly to at the time, and they would do something on the beach, but they seemed to be careless about set and setting even there. They would do group sessions, and so other patients' experiences would bleed into your own. And there were other elements that are pretty common that rubbed me the wrong way, such as appropriating aspects of Native American ritual, like dress
Drumming.
or
Yeah.
drumming, bringing crow's wings, that sort of thing, where I just found it culturally inappropriate and not meaningful for me personally, and
Yeah.
rather something that's just kind of being imposed on me because of the guide's associations of what psilocybin means.
Right.
And so ultimately what I did was I created a very, very private experience for myself. I was alone in a bedroom. I had a playlist, but I didn't start playing it. And Sonia, my wife, was outside in case I needed anything. But otherwise, I wanted it to be in very specific, controlled circumstances so that nothing would bleed in and lead me in a particular direction that I didn't choose.
Right. So I'm going to talk also about my experience, my soul experience with psychedelics in a minute. But for now, I wanted to put on the table that big question of how do you scale up the kind of intensive psychotherapy that this seems to require to be effective. That's, I think, the biggest question about psychedelic assisted therapy, but it's far from the only question. I want to rattle off a few more questions before I close with my own personal experience. Here are some other questions in no particular order. As I mentioned, there's ample research suggesting that one or a few doses of psychedelics can lead to significant reductions in anxiety and improved quality of life, but we'll need more longitudinal studies to better gauge their long-term effects. It's promising right now, but we really don't know how long they last. We need to see whether they last beyond weeks and months to potentially years of effectiveness. Here's another question. What's the safe and optimal dosing of psychedelics? How should dosing sessions unfold, and what therapeutic techniques should be used? Are there sex differences in how psychedelics are tolerated? Who will train all the new psychedelic therapists? And here's a question that's being hotly debated by the research community right now. Are the hallucinogenic effects of psychedelics integral to their therapeutic effects? Or might microdosing provide ongoing benefits without the trip? Here's a challenge facing psychedelic drug research that I found particularly interesting. Can we prove conclusively that psychedelics are actually causing the wonderful outcomes we've been discussing? After all, the gold standard in identifying treatment-specific effects is the double-blind, randomized controlled trial. But the strong physical and psychological effects of psychedelics make it difficult to conduct such trials because it's so easy for participants to know whether they receive the drug or the placebo, a phenomenon known as unblinding. If participants know they received a psychedelic that they believe will improve their symptoms, that knowledge alone can affect their clinical outcomes. Researchers are attempting to mask that distinction by using placebos like niacin that mimic some aspects of the hallucinogenic drug experience.
Okay. But hopefully does not mimic those aspects of the drug that are actually related to therapeutic beneficial outcomes, because
Yes.
that would also screw up the science. But
Right.
yeah, the basic problem is that no one has ever seen God after taking a sugar pill. So it's pretty obvious if you were the one who got the psilocybin.
Yes, that's right. And when I saw niacin, I thought that's a familiar name. That's something that's on the list of ingredients in your multivitamin, but apparently it has some like quasi psychedelic effects if it's taken in an intensive dose. So they're hoping that kind of will throw people off the scent and make them not sure whether they got a placebo or the actual drug.
Which also, now that I think of it, kind of begs the question, because it's a possibility that the feeling that you have seen God is one of the effects that brings a change. Like you mentioned that the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous stopped drinking after a psychedelic experience. And his methodology is so deeply ingrained in God being the instrument of change that I would imagine that his psychedelic experience was seeing God. And that was what motivated the change in his life. So if through microdosing or otherwise you remove the actual psychedelic experience, the vision, the perception, then even taking neuroplasticity out of the question, you might have thereby rendered the drug less effective.
Yes, as I said, this is the raging debate going on right now. And my take on this is that it's kind of a both and not an either or, right? I think for some people, the transcendence of the distorted psychedelic experience means everything. And that's where the life-changing outcomes start from. But it's also being proven true that microdosing works, that there's something about the chemistry of these drugs that deeply affects things like PTSD, whether or not you have a revelatory, quasi-mystical experience. So it's probably both.
Yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, I agree. Definitely, the discourse within the mushroom community is dominated by people who believe that the mushroom allows you to see a higher truth. And so that for them is the effective ingredient in the mushroom. It's not neuroplasticity. It's piercing the veil and seeing ultimate reality. And that is the effect of the drug that has the greatest impact on their life.
Yes. Okay, one more set of questions before we get to my personal ending on this subject. So, will the newfound popularity of psychedelics lead some people to think they can self-medicate? More people are using magic mushrooms recreationally, you obviously being one of them, Mark. And that has led to a tripling not only of law enforcement seizures between 2017 and 2022, but also of calls to poison control centers related to the use of psilocybin by adolescents. In one study, 11% of recreational users reported persisting negative effects from their unsupervised use. We can safely guess that once psychedelics are FDA approved for medicinal purposes, their use is bound to skyrocket, as happened with marijuana a while back. The therapy industrial complex admits it's not prepared for that. Nor are the guidelines clear about who should even be using psychedelics. We know that people suffering from psychotic disorders or cardiovascular ailments shouldn't use them. Anyone else? Researchers have noticed that risk-averse people and people afraid of losing control seem to struggle more with psychedelics. That may result in a strong selection bias in the people who decide to participate in these studies in the first place, and it also suggests there might be observable traits that can be used to predict who would benefit from the treatment and who wouldn't.
A point that I remember from the Polian book is he postulated that there's sort of a continuum between rigidly controlled personalities and fairly chaotic personalities. Towards the end of chaos, you might find artists. Towards controlled, you might find accountants. But everyone falls somewhere on that continuum. And in a way, what psychedelics do is they push you in the direction of chaos. They pull you out of control and into the free-form flowing of stuff. And that could be particularly therapeutic or liberating for someone who is excessively controlled. And I would tend to put myself in that category. But if you are more towards the chaotic end of the spectrum, it might push you too far in that direction where it could be psychologically damaging. And I don't know if there's been any actual scientific work in that regard, but I remember that being a very thought-provoking postulate that he put in there.
Yes, I did not read about that in my research, but that's very interesting to me. I am that aforementioned risk-averse person, and also kind of a very controlling person, particularly about my own circumstances. I'm afraid of losing control. And that's why it took me so long to try LSD. I took it only once in my late 20s with a close friend who had taken it many times before and had been asking me for years to trip with him. We were in New Orleans, a place I had never been before, for the wedding of a childhood friend. After dropping the acid, I remember walking around the French Quarter and seeing all these sickly thin and morbidly obese native Louisianans whose bodies were distorted by my LSD goggles in comical ways. My trip wasn't a bad one, and it didn't fall outside the parameters of other trips I've read or heard about. It was recreational use, with no therapists or prep sessions or integration therapy thereafter, though I sure wish my session had been videotaped. Even so, there was one aspect of my trip that adhered to the therapeutic protocol, and that was the role of music. After returning from our stroll around the French Quarter to the safety of our room, my friend and I listened to one of our all-time favorite records, the Beatles' 1966 album Revolver. Now, Sgt. Pepper is closely associated with the Beatles' use of LSD, but to Beatles fans in the know like me, Revolver is the far trippier record. Anyway, my friend and I just laid back and listened to the album in its entirety, and it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. This familiar music provided a safe cocoon for the rest of my trip, and yet, not only was I hearing it in colors, synesthesia, but I heard things in the mix that I'd never heard before. For example, I could clearly hear the Beatles' intake of breath before they sang each line of each song. I thought I had unlocked a whole new way of hearing sound, and I couldn't wait to listen to the album again after the effects of the LSD had worn off. I did, and alas, I couldn't hear those breaths anymore. But for what it's worth, Mark, I remain convinced to this day that I was not imagining what I heard. Rather, with the assistance of LSD, my senses were so super sharp, so crystal clear, that I could hear things in the tape that were simply not audible to normal, sober humans. Now, I tell this story because it helps explain why I am inclined to believe that psychedelics mark a paradigm shift in the way we deal with people suffering from depression and trauma. Their effects are truly mind-blowing. I experienced them myself, and I can only imagine what an experienced psychotherapist might be able to unlock after guiding the journeys of depressed or traumatized subjects into altered consciousness. But the potential is even greater than that. The treatable population for whom psychedelics might help is fast expanding to cover not only obvious cases like the soldier with PTSD or the victim of violent crime, but also people grappling with a terminal cancer diagnosis, or facing palliative hospice care, or trying to quit drinking or smoking, or struggling with OCD or an eating disorder, or a chronic pain disorder like migraines. As we speak, there are clinical trials ongoing for all those situations and more. As one of the studies I read concluded, the re-emergence of psychedelics after being suppressed for so long by a fearful culture, quote, challenges reductionist models and offers a more expansive, integrative vision of human well-being. As science, culture, and policy converge around this promising frontier, the question is no longer whether psychedelics have a role to play, but how we will responsibly shape and share that role for generations to come. End quote. I agree. How about you?
I certainly have thoughts to share, but my first is a follow-up question. It sounds like you only had the one LSD experience. You were never tempted to try it again.
I've been tempted to try it again since I had it, but I have not done so. And I think that gets to what you were saying about the controlled environment. This is recreational use, but I don't want to do it in a manner that's going to result in a bad trip. I want to be with people I trust, and it just hasn't happened for me. But I really do hope I'm able to do it again.
Yeah, what you described to me, walking down the streets of New Orleans high on LSD, that would be the opposite of how I do it. I'd be so afraid that there'd be something that would send me down the path of a bad trip.
Yes.
So, yeah, maybe that was my need for control exerting it. Like I was so controlling of the setting when I did the mushrooms. And I did do it more than once. I did it once and I had a good experience. Fun things, like there was a flower in a pot in the room. And I looked over and the flower was kind of swaying. And in the moment, it felt like the flower was doing a little dance for me. So sort of that sense of union with the universe. Like, it wasn't just, oh, look, my vision is distorted. The flower is swaying. I saw the flower as doing a dance for me. And then I came back like maybe a few weeks later and tried to do it again. And for whatever reason, that time the mushrooms were just a dud. I had no effect at all. So then I made a mistake. I came back to try again and I doubled the dosage because I was like, I didn't have any effect the previous time. I'm definitely going to get effect this time. And wow, was the effect very strong that third time, where the only way I describe it is it felt like psychically I was being squished. I know that means nothing to you, but that was the experience, and it was excruciating and the sort of thing I would not want to do again. I haven't done it since then because my most recent experience was so powerful. For me, looking back, the most positive impact of both experiences, and I wish it had lasted forever, is that both times when I was coming out of it and the visual hallucinations went away, for about 2 hours, I was just drifting on a sea of love. I just loved everything exactly as it was, total acceptance.
Right.
And it was bliss. It was an absolute blissful experience of love, which I've never experienced before or since. And if you could can that, that would be the drug that people would never stop taking. It was just such a euphoric state. And
yes,
it was also peaceful at the same time. It was this peaceful acceptance.
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts about what you just said. The first is your second trip, you probably accidentally ate a portobello thinking it was magic, but they taste magical, but they have no magic effects. But beyond that, I think what you talked about underscores why intensive psychotherapy is required for people who are hurting and take these drugs, because it can easily go bad if the dosing is not right, the mindset is not right, and the setting is not right. And you kind of ran afoul of your own rules the third time inadvertently. And I ran afoul of my rules too, taking it in New Orleans. I kind of got cajoled into doing that. I would never take it in a strange place again, even though I didn't have a bad trip. And then my final thought is about the primacy of love. That is something that many people talk about after taking LSD and psilocybin in particular. And there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever that when John Lennon wrote All You Need Is Love, shortly after spending a year taking LSD semi-regularly, that's what it did to him as well. So,
yeah.
And it is something we wish we could bottle, but think about the power of feeling awash in love if you're recovering from some awful trauma. You were sexually abused, you experienced the ravages of war, you live afraid, what that can do, the power that has. It's just so inspiring and encouraging that we could harness these drugs for those purposes.
Yeah, and also you mentioned those who'd received terminal diagnoses for cancer, and that is beneficial for these.
Yes.
Imagine how much peace it would bring to experience the universe as being just a sea of love. That would be where you would need and want to be if your life is coming to an end. And
Yes.
it could be a very beautiful thing.
My father-in-law wanted to take psychedelics when he was near death from Parkinson's. And I think it would have been a beautiful experience for him. But because the drugs are still illegal, as soon as he announced his intention to take them, the wonderful supportive hospice team that he was working with basically said, well, if you do that, then we need to step back away from the treatment because that's illegal. And, we don't want to be sued, especially if something bad happens to you. And so that just shows how screwed up it is that these drugs remain Schedule I controlled substances. We really need the FDA to approve them for medicinal use so that people who have late-stage terminal cancer can experience those benefits without having to worry about the things that my father-in-law had to worry about.
Yeah, where the first reaction to people like your father-in-law is empathy rather than concern about liability. Exactly.
Yes. Right.
I feel in addition to things like experiencing love, one of the less heralded, but I think equally therapeutic aspects of psychedelics is it shows you that the way you empirically observe the universe is contingent. You can perceive different things. You can experience different things by way of certain substances. And when you're on the substance, those things seem as objectively real as empirical reality appears to you in other circumstances. And I could see where the trap of depression is you see the world as a dark, cold place without hope. And you're convinced that that is simple empirical reality. And it is very helpful for someone like that to be reminded that what you think is real is maybe just what you can see in this moment.
Right.
And that there are things outside of that that you're not able to see right now. And so maybe for someone like that, a drug helps them take a step back, see different things, and bring back the memory that what you see now is not what you can see at all times. It's just what is visible to you in this moment.
Yeah, that's well said. And it makes me think about why suicide is so boundlessly sad, because you just don't get another opportunity. You just surrender to that deep sadness and you don't get a chance to get a redo once you kill yourself. And, there are, it also reminds me of neuroplasticity, that forging new neural pathways is one of the things that psychedelic therapy does. So people with depression might be able to get out of that framework that you just described and think of things in a different way. And besides the revelatory awash in love, there's the whole rewiring of the brain aspect. So it's such potential. And I think, hopefully 20 years from now, this podcast episode will be utterly obsolete because these therapies will be widespread and people will be seeing the benefits from them.
Yes, but our wisdom is timeless, Joe. You got to know that. Our wisdom is timeless.
Yes.
Let's bring it home on that hopeful note because I share your hope in that regard. I think psychedelics hold enormous promise that we need to explore, maybe figure out the best ways to engage with it, certainly to do so in a way that's safe for the people who go there. But there's so much potential there. It's just a shame that we spent 40 years being afraid of it, and now finally we're swinging around and maybe taking a second look.
Yeah, well, the war on drugs was fucked up for so many reasons, and this is just yet another one.
Yeah.
All right. I have a question for you for next time. You ready?
I am ready for it.
Okay. Our next episode, Mansplaining fans, will be taped the week before Christmas, which means it's time for our annual holiday-themed question. In prior years, we discussed the origins of Christmas and New Year's Day. We passed along good news that doesn't make headlines, talked about what we're thankful for, and how to heal a seemingly intractable political divide. I want to keep things light and fun this year, so my question is about the holiday music that gets played on the radio and in stores over and over and over again this time of year. Mark, what's your favorite holiday music? What's your least favorite? And why? And please don't feel restricted to one choice in each category if there are a few that stand out. After I hear your choices, I'll probably chime in with my own.
Okay. Well, immediately the phrase, "have a holly jolly Christmas," pops into my head, but you'll have to wait for the episode to find
know
out
whether
if
it's
it's my favorite
good
or my
or
least
bad.
favorite.
Okay, nice teaser. Well done.
Okay, well, hopefully our listeners will not have a holly jolly Christmas stuck in their head between now and when our next episode drops, but if they do, maybe they can get out by thinking really hard about the doorway of perception and what might be waiting on the other side. In the meantime, I'll be out thinking about my favorite and least favorite songs, and we'll come back to you just before Christmas with our reviews, what's hot and what's not in Christmas music. Until then, that was Joe, and this is Mark, and we'll see you soon.
Talk to you next time.
On me, I need help right now. I need to go to Tripsville and how. Don't say no to that psychedelic drug. Enjoy the show when it pulls the rug out from under your reality without morality. Take a look, Mr. Huxley. My mind is splattering, shattering, infinite patterns scattering into an alternate reality. So flattering. None of the old and life begins at proprioception. My acid queen takes your sober up. Yeah, I know it's all gobbledygook. Dig this, my hippie chick on this trip we're taking. I can touch the smell of your voice, taste the sight of your breath, hear the pallor of your skin, and it's all good. It's all love. Is it a mystical incision or just my tinnitus? Don't say no to that psychedelic drug. Enjoy the show when it pulls the rug out from under your reality with finality.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.